we're just going to perhaps just give a little bit of information about what social workers are currently telling us they care about in relation to environment. Just going to give a short presentation of the research that BASW has done into social workers' perspectives on sustainability. And I think in some ways it's quite heartening that there is care out there. So I'll just say that. And my colleague Rosanne's going to join me. I'm just going to very quickly go through this. We have an annual survey in BASW, and in 2023, into the beginning of 24, we added in some specific sustainability questions. The good thing about that was people weren't expecting to answer questions about sustainability, so it wasn't a self-selected sample of people who care. So it was, and we had over 1,200 responses. So I've said a bit already about why we are looking at environmental sustainability. I've already said this, and I just want to point out this important document at an international level, at a global level, that was very much kind of coordinated, but with many organisations involved, the People's Charter for an Eco-Social World, which is available on the IFSW website, and this is an important blueprint for social work's development, or certainly something to stimulate our further thinking. So we were responding to this in asking the questions. So we asked about environmental degradation on people whom social workers work with. We asked about green spaces and green initiatives. We asked about employers' policies, the priority concerns that people had, and what does sustainability in social work mean to you, if anything? And, oh, there we go. And we've got a report, which is not available yet in hard copy, but we're hoping that some courier will drop it off tomorrow. But there's a QR code, and if you want to read the, you can just put your phones up to that if you want to, and this will get you into this this short report. So I'll just give you a moment for that. But we want to just share, in brief, the main findings from this survey. Because I said I hope it's interesting. It's interesting. Okay, everybody got their little debrief. What would we do if we didn't have a moment every 20 minutes where we've got our phones out kind of pointing it at something or other? It's an interesting question in itself. Okay. So, but this will be available and the QR code will be available. So, so Rosanne's just going to talk through some of the main findings about what social workers told us.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see so many people here this morning. Not quite sure how I'm going to follow our opening act. But what I'd like to do is just give you a few highlights from, firstly, the descriptive statistics that we got from this year's annual survey, but then we also asked a qualitative question on what sustainability in social work means to you, if anything. So we're going to also just briefly look at some of those thoughts. Ruth said about the QR code, don't worry if you missed it, it is also on the slide at the end. So firstly, we looked at impact on people using social work services. We started with responsibility to understand that impact, something we've already heard about in full this morning. And as you can see, more than 4/5 of our respondents agreed or strongly agreed that social workers had a responsibility in this area. Almost 3/4 agreed that the people they were working with were being negatively affected by the climate crisis and/or environmental degradation. And then we asked a specific question about government-funded initiatives on insulation and energy-efficient homes, and again, you can see almost 85% were in agreement with that. We asked about use of local green initiatives, both in a personal and in a professional capacity. We did, as you will see in the report, those of you that look at it, you'll see that we did actually give some examples of what we mean, because we understand local green initiatives might seem a bit of an abstract term. You can see that our respondents were engaging more in a personal capacity than they were in a professional capacity, but people could actually see the benefits. They could see that access to green initiatives could have a positive impact on the lives of the people they were working with. We asked about use of local green space. It's a little bit more unpacked in the report. We recognise that local green spaces aren't accessible for everybody for a range of reasons. So when people say that they don't have access to green spaces, it might actually be that they cannot, for some reason, access green spaces. So you can see 50%, roughly half, agreed that the people they were working with had regular access. Almost 2/3 encouraged use of local green space as part of their practice, and over 3/4 recognised the positive impact of green space access on the well-being of people they worked with. We also asked in a personal capacity, and again you can see here, people using them, lots of our respondents using it in a personal capacity, and lots of them recognising the positive impact. We asked about employers. There were just 2 questions on this. Just under 1/3 agreed that their employers supported them to adopt environmentally sustainable ways of working, and roughly 45% agreed or strongly agreed that they knew their employer had a policy on environmental sustainability. We're not sure if that means that the employer doesn't have the policy, or it might just not be very well advertised and well known within the organisation. We couldn't unpack that one. We also then we put together a list of options, and our respondents could choose as many as they wanted. So you'll see nothing adds up to 100% in the final column, just on whether they recognised these as potential environmental risks to the people they were working with. You can see at the top with 3/4 access or affordability of nutritious food. We know this is a problem. Our colleague Dominic Waters has done a lot of work around this. But also you see then extreme cold at almost 3/5, flooding at almost 1/2, air pollution just below flooding. Essentially only 2, one was psychological impact, strangely enough, one was fire, came up at less than 1/3 of people recognising them as environmental risks. And you can see that only 5% didn't choose any of the above. Finally, moving on to the qualitative question, we asked an open-ended question about what the term sustainability in social work means to you as the respondent, if anything. And what we got here was really very much 2 strands of thinking. There was one strand that was very focused on actually, what about the sustainability of social work? What about the sustainability of social workers? What about the workforce? So we had something like 553 comments in response to this question out of the 1,215 respondents. The predominant theme was, we need to look after the social work workforce. So this takes us a step away from the environmental stuff, but it's also a recognition that unless we look after the workforce, we can't help anybody else through either. So the topics that came up there, the issues that came up, were around retention, recruitment, burnout, caseload, management, fair pay, resources. These are familiar themes to us all. Little quote there, nobody gains from having a high turnover of staff. This was also linked to personal impact and self-care, so how we look after ourselves to enable us to do the work, not burning out. Several people put it that simply. And also, in broader terms, the sustainability of the profession. So looking at issues like funding, resources, identity of social work as a profession, particularly in an age of growing integration with healthcare. And the core values of social work as well. Those core values, the ethics, that which makes social work so distinct as a profession. And somebody said, we can't do more with less, no matter which way you try to flower that up. We then, I might have to stand slightly closer to the screen for this one, just as a reminder. There was then another strand. Can't stand closer to the screen, the microphone's over here. There was then another strand, one which I termed broad view. It took a very all-encompassing, holistic approach, and it brought all sorts of strands in together. Some of it talked about injustices, social injustice, climate injustice. Some of it talked about how we respond to disaster and how we manage that disaster response. A lot of it talked about community and actually having sustainability within our communities so people can help each other. And actually, how do we get sustainable solutions for the people that we work with so that when the social worker or the intervention is withdrawn from them, they can carry on making that change and they can carry on benefiting from the work that's being done. Another strand was linked back specifically to the climate crisis. How can we do our work in a sustainable way that actually doesn't deprive future generations of resources and doesn't deprive future generations of their future? And there was a recognition as well within this strand that there is kind of a tension related to that previous strand around sustainability of the workforce, which is when you are facing very urgent issues on a day-to-day basis, how do you balance that out around the longer-term view and those longer-term needs? And then finally we had a strand that has come to be sort of known as nothing, and that's a very broad term for people who hadn't really thought about what sustainability might mean for social work, or who genuinely didn't feel at this point that the phrase had any meaning for them. I think that's it. Yeah. So,
okay. So thank you. So I should have properly, Roseanne Palmer is our policy and research officer, and she led on this research. So thank you. I should have properly introduced you. I'm getting too informal. So I think you can see that we were actually pleasantly surprised that the level of engagement and awareness was that high. We couldn't have guessed necessarily that that would happen in a sample of social workers who weren't expecting questions about environmental and other sustainability issues. So there's more in the report, but we see this as a basis for further understanding where social workers are now in the UK and wider on these issues. And of course, there's much more to be said and learned from this. So thank you, Roseanne. We're going to move on now to our next speaker. So I'll just leave that there for the QR. Can I please introduce our final two, but last but not least, absolutely, our final two speakers, my colleague from IFSW and in other ways, Josien Hofs, who's from the Dutch Association of Social Workers and is the lead of the IFSW Europe Eco-Social Project. And we are hot foot, several of us, others in the room actually, from a wonderful event that her and our other speaker, Professor Richard de Brabander, also organised last week on taking forward eco-social social work in Europe. And over to you. Thank you.
Are you still there? All of you, maybe stand up and move a bit before I start. Because, well, all this sitting and listening. Okay, thank you. Well, we had two wonderful speeches, and they give us really something to reflect on. Thank you, Caroline Hickman and team, for your wonderful speech that gives us something to reflect on. Stunning figures and stories you told us. Thank you, Roseanne, for the research results. I think we had quite something like that in the Netherlands, so maybe we can talk about it later. But in the first place, I'm very happy to have a reason to come to Scotland again, which happens to be my favorite holiday destination. So, and then in Edinburgh, full of history, close to Holyrood House, with all those beautiful stories of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the stabbing of her lover. But not to mention my favorite city in Scotland, which happens to be Glasgow. But well, we're not here for history nor for tourism. So much more to thank BASW about. And that's in the first place for lending your CEO, Ruth Allen, to IFSW Euro as a president. We couldn't be more pleased. Thank you, Ruth. And thank you, BASW. And thanks, BASW, for inviting us to the stage today. And we tried to share some of the experiences of IFSW on eco-social projects. I read it for you because English is not my native language, so it's a bit difficult to speak fluently. We started this project about 4 or 5 years ago, and the main activities had been advocating for eco-social thinking, sharing ideas and activities, and building a network. We had quite some webinars and workshops, most of them online. We started at the Zagreb conference in 2020, where I had my first workshop on eco-social work, and under the name of How Can You Think Green When Your Bank Account is in the Red? And I already met some people from the UK there on that workshop. I think one of them was Kate from Southampton. Welcome, Kate. And we marched forward with webinars with people from all over Europe. We had discussions on the meetings in Berlin. We had a keynote speech from my good friend Richard in Prague. We had the workshop, wonderful paper presentations from all kinds of countries in Europe. And last week we had, as Ruth mentioned, our eco-social conference in Rotterdam, which was very inspiring. And in the meantime, working on this, we discovered all kinds of green initiatives that already existed, like common kitchen gardens, food forests, bringing green into stony neighborhoods, green mental health initiatives, etc. This was not always recognized as social work, or even as a challenge to social work. But climate change became more and more pressing, and we came to realize that the eco-social theme of our work must be the basics of our work. We see who is suffering the most from climate change: water shortages, heat stress, high energy prices, diseases, etc. These are the communities and the individuals we work with, the ones who seek for our assistance in life. And it doesn't pass our own doorstep either. To quote our American colleague Meredith Powers, important publisher from the introduction of the IFSW publication Sustainable Development Goals Part 3, as a reaction to climate change and our ways of destroying what is feeding us, our national environment. Quote, "We must stop seeing ourselves as the top of the pyramid. We have to learn to respect all living creatures on Mother Earth, the seen and the unseen. We cannot afford to maintain the obviousness of economic growth, as it is becoming a threat to all life. There are no easy solutions. Our ways of living have to change if we want to live in an eco-social work where no one is left behind." End of quote. And the next question is, how do we contribute as social workers to this challenge to change? There are already very inspiring examples, like the way social workers help in times of natural disaster, like the floodings in Europe, like the way social workers are at the ready when citizens in housing estates are confronted with high energy prices, and when they need to accept the transition from fossil fuels to electricity in their houses. Community workers discover the possibilities of working with all kinds of green initiatives. I don't know much about how this works in the UK, but I'm sure there must be many. But is this enough? Mustn't we do more to influence our communities, our city councils, our national governments? Mustn't we do more to involve other professions, to learn from biologists, from architects, from environmentalists? I am totally aware of the fact that not every social worker is personally ready, suitable, or even willing to be an activist. But as a profession, we need activism. if not in person, then as a supporter. Last week we had a European conference on the subject. It has been wonderful to share ideas, experiences, to help each other think. Richard and I came up with the idea of this conference, and we are pleased with the opportunity to share a few outcomes with you. Richard leads a research center on eco-social work at InHolland University in Rotterdam and plays an important role not only in research but also in developing ideas and ways of thinking. Richard, may I invite you to tell a bit more about what you think are some of the results of our conference?
I think the mic is on, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the BASW, how you pronounce it. I thought it was BASW. I practice it in Rotterdam. For inviting me at this conference. It's really an honor for me and a great pleasure to be here. It's also more or less difficult to summarize what we have discussed in 2 days in Rotterdam, but I will try to make some comments on it. What we did try to do was to put to set a learning, research, and an action agenda. But one of the first remarks made during the work session was you should put the action agenda at the first place. So we have to work on a learning or an action learning agenda in which research just participates. And that is really important, I think, because speaking about also leaving no one behind, it's almost the researchers who set the agenda, what is important, but I think also as researchers we should listen to people in vulnerable positions, what their experiences are. So there's a very important lesson for us to take. That said, I want to just say some words about how I conceive or consider eco-social work. For me, I think there's a statement that that all social work should be eco-social work, or that social work is already eco-social work. So it's not just about greening communities or sustainability. I have some problems with the term of sustainability because at least in the Netherlands, I don't know how it's in the UK, of course, but in the Netherlands, it's more or less becoming meaningless. Everyone is sustainable at the moment. Even my university is striving to be, profiling itself as sustainable. But if you see the ranking, they are, 3 of the lowest. So we have a lot to do. I'm trained as a philosopher, so I'm sorry if I become too much philosophical in the minute. But for me, eco-social work is a paradigm, and we need a paradigm shift. It's about values, it's about convictions, ideas, and ways of thinking, and how we think and perceive our reality, also how we perceive people we work with. Yeah. And we are used to think in models, causalities, protocols, procedures, etc., etc. And I think we need to change our ways of perceiving reality, social reality, also the relations, how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we are relating to nature and reality. And that's, of course, extremely difficult to do so. For me, eco-social work is about justice. I came on the subject via my research on the politicization of social work, human rights, etc. And if you also need a lead, you all know, of course, the global definition of social work. It's about promoting social justice. And if you look at the climate change and the causes, for example, the IPCC report stated that it's human-induced, but we should note that climate change is human-induced, but a very small part of the world population is inducing climate change. I looked at the figures, it's 20% of the global world population who is accountable for and responsible for 92% of the emissions worldwide. So that is injustice. And I think that the climate change is a multiplier of inequalities. It was just mentioned by you. Also the impact, of course, is vulnerable people have much more consequences to bear on climate change than people like me, for example. Although I had my problems with flooding, living in a house where the bedrooms were below street level, so 6 times I have to put out the water from my bed, but that's nothing to share. It also has to do, of course, with health issues. It has to do with lifestyle issues. But the main thing, if you look at the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, it's mostly an economic and a technological issue. And it's not about social issue. So, do we still have time? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So we have to shift our paradigm, and that is extremely difficult. But what came up across in the different work sessions we had 5 work sessions. One was paradigm shift, eco-social justice, indigenous and local knowledge. The other was about from ego to eco, and the last one was about education. And in all these work sessions, what we heard at the summary, there was a kind of general issue, and that was about that we have to change our mindset. That is that we have to start with. We have to change our way of thinking and perceiving. And that brought me to also that I have to look at the notes sometimes because I'm sorry. So what we are dealing with at the moment is a hierarchy of knowledges. And when I was writing an article in English and I wrote the knowledges in the plural, they said that can't. You can't write knowledge in the plural. That's very strange. It's also in the Dutch where knowledge is translated as kennis, but kennissen, that would be the plural, but that are French. That's something completely different. And that yesterday when I was evening when I was writing this down, I said there is no plural of the knowledge, which is very strange because we have very different ways of knowing. And there is also a hierarchy of knowing. First, of course, the scientific rationality. Guys like me. We have evidence-based versus practice-based. We have the so-called experiential knowledge. I don't know if that's a word. Yeah, that's a word in the UK also, the client and residence. And I think we have to break, we have to skip thinking in a hierarchy of knowledges, and we have to think about the different ways of knowing as an ecosystem. So they are independent, sometimes they are different, they complement and supplement each other, they intertwine and change each other, they enrich each other, but also they can be parasitic and feed each other. So I think that an ecosystem way of dealing with these different kinds of knowledges also allows us to think more in ambiguities and paradoxes and so on. Because we are facing a lot of paradoxes, I think, in the social reality. And that's the way to skip our linear way of thinking. We have a kind of industrial way of thinking. It's like a fabric. Also, our institutions. Someone was what you was talking about. Our institutions. Oh, they are very hierarchic. They know what to do, etc., etc. So we have to work on our imagination, and there is a writer. I think you all know Amitav Ghosh. who has a book written about the great derangement, and in which he says the climate crisis is a crisis of imagination. So, at our education, at our schools, we have to start with the different kind of imagination, to work with students, and we can do that very concretely using, well, if you're doing research, don't bore them with surveys, but start with theater, with photo voice, with all kinds of art-based research methods. That was pleading for. Well, yes, there was one thing I would like to say, that is that we have to create our own language. I think that the language of education, social work and research is colonized by the managerial language. Sarah Banks, you all know, of course, Sarah Banks has written a marvelous book about professional ethics, in which she has, how you say, defended that the new public management discourse has deflated the professional ethics, and I totally agree with that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard. Well, maybe one last remark before we leave the stage for the next thing.
Questions?
Yeah. My last remark will be, I read on in the show of what Rosanne told us, that social workers, when it's about eco-social work, they're afraid they have to do more. I don't think that is the message, because we cannot do more than we already do, but we can do differently. And that's the message we will support today. Thank you. Are there any questions?
For some questions and discussion with the audience. And we're going to invite, if that's okay, we're going to invite our other speakers back up onto the floor, because you might have questions for any of them. So we're just going to put up another chair or two, if you'd like to come back up. I'm going to just do this. There you go. There are many tasks for the CEO, and this is the sort of thing I actually really enjoy. So there we go. Let's pop that on there. And there's another chair coming the other side. So, we have row behind, and we'd really like to get some questions. And I have one question online already, but do we have somebody with their hand up at the back? Mark has a question. Yes, Mark. Sorry, I can't see Mark. Hi, Mark's there.
I know we can't afford not to, but how do we make it climate change affordable?
How do we make this affordable? So that's the question. I've got that right, Mark? Yeah. So affordability in the changes that are needed, I guess in social work, but maybe in society. Does anybody have any responses to that?
I don't know much about social work, but I think it's unaffordable to not do anything. And I think that's kind of how we have to think of it. I loved that final remark about it's about doing things differently, not doing more.
Yeah. I think, and I'm just going to very quickly respond to that, I think we talk a lot about affordability in the short term, by which I mean the next 10 years, which is actually short term considering what we're talking about, or the next 2 years or the next 1 year. But this is about how do we, I take your point about the word sustainability, Richard. Of course, it's like it gets misused all the time, like renewable or recyclable even gets misused. Mm-hmm. But this is about transitions, and this is what we're completely struggling with, and we're going back on. We've had some transitioning plans in the UK, in the EU, and at the moment we're seeing a pushback, and a lack of affordability is being given as the reason, and that's because it's stopping the accumulation of wealth within the current, not stopping actually, but it's seen as stopping, it's argued it's stopping the accumulation of wealth on the current economic model. So we do have to understand, as social workers, we're not necessarily sometimes we are strong on economics, but we probably need to be even more strong if we're going to persuade our governments about what transition and just transition might look like. So, but what can we afford not to do? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Russ?
Do I need a microphone?
Yeah, I know you've got a loud voice, but you still need... And you're used to public speaking, but...
Thank you very much. First of all, can I congratulate you all on the excellent presentations, and a round of applause for the audience, please. That's amazing. Thank you. In this current world, when sadly a lot of people only think about today, one of my areas of interest is health. That's mainly because I'm always ill, and people aren't interested in health until they become ill. So how do we change that conversation when it comes to sustainability and climate change? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So the question was about how do we, I guess, engage people in the fact this affects them or their families, even if they don't think it does. Does anybody have any kind of thoughts about that? Caroline, you look like you're
start,
on. Yes, that would be
and
helpful.
then see if somebody... I thought what you were saying about the paradigm shift was really important, because we have to understand that humanity has never faced anything like this before. So we don't actually know how to do it. We don't have any maps, which is good in a way, because we could write our own maps, which means we could create the future worlds that we're more interested in seeing there. And it's bad because we keep looking backwards to help ourselves navigate forwards, and there is nothing. So it really is a necessity that we have this holistic approach, which is psychological, social, political, grounded in social justice and intergenerational justice, and looks at where we've come from in order to go forwards. This question is a great question, but it also links to the first question. And what we need to wake up to is the fact that we're halfway through the story of climate change. We're not at the beginning. So any thinking about how can we deal with this in future is an absolute nightmare for us, because we're halfway through the story. We're not at the start. It's not too late to change the end of the story, but we have to realize we're halfway through in order to change the end of the story. And when we keep pushing it into the future or seeing it as a distant problem, emotionally, psychologically, politically, we will not take the steps we need to take. And we won't see it in that holistic way, which is this is health and sanity, and I do not want to be the one dealing with the mental health and fallout in 20 years' time if we don't deal with this now.
Thank you. Any other comments from... Yes,
I was going to say, I read an article in The Guardian the other day about the use of green spaces and how much the researchers found it improves children's well-being, their IQ improves, and isn't it great they should have more green spaces? And I was really aware, well, a few generations ago, they all had green spaces. So it's actually, this is where the child safeguarding issue comes in, is these children are being brought up in something that they need to have and has been taken away from them before they were even born. I think we need to start reframing how we talk about those things and including them, integrating them in all our assessments and our work so that we're understanding these children are already being harmed by air pollution in vitro, yeah? They're being harmed every moment they breathe. They're being harmed by the lack of green space. So it's already there, so we need to sort of start talking about it integrally as part of our practice.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question. I think we've had one at the back and then we'll come forward again because we had one. I'm trying to take them in order. I'm probably failing. I'm doing my best. Maybe I should... There we go.
Dr. Beverly Barnett-Jones. I'm a social worker from England. A couple of points, really. One was just to ask the question, which is, you know, what we see happening in Europe around the significant rise of hard right, far right activity. And constructed as a rejection of the sustainability Green Deal arguments and the threat that is to democracy. So part of the argument around, you know, why we need the changes is that we're trying to also, you know, keep democracy alive, and we're in a context as social workers that we need to understand what the threat is to our democracy in the UK, as well as what's happening in Europe. Where we are now, we could be in Europe in 5 years' time, because we're at a cusp around our politics in our country right now, because we do have a rising force that is manipulating and using the necessity of dealing with climate destruction as a way of saying they're all against you. The very people that need the highest protections are being manipulated and sucked into that kind of set of responses. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, when I started in social work, I was a community social worker. So a lot of the work I did was going around and counting how many broken windows there were in the local flats and making arguments about getting repairs done on time. So, you know, there was an activity around social work that was really important because we were in the community working. Oh, it's gone up. Oh, it's gone up. Can you hear me, people?
It's working. It's okay if you use it. It's working.
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There's a bit of a hum.
So it's just like, not to forget that there are roots in our social work practice, you know, that we can find and refashion and reuse in terms of how we see ourselves in relation to each other, but also to our communities and children and families that we are safeguarding in the language of safeguarding, which I don't fancy too much, but, you know, the work that we do as social workers. So I think we should, you know, although it feels incredibly depressing at times, there is internationally great things happening, but also in local spaces and local places, there are important interventions happening which are around protecting children and families, you know, from the worst vestiges of what climate destruction is doing to our to our society. So for me as a social worker, I'm very obsessed at the moment with place, spaces, and, you know, design and architects, and having these kind of conversations with people. I'd like to see those in our social work curriculum, you know, as well as our focus on maybe, you know, attachment and other forms of social work that we kind of obsess on sometimes.
Beverly, thank you. Thank you so much. So there were two issues there. The first was about the big politics and the shift that we're seeing to the right, particularly in many... we had our own issues here in the UK, and then we've had elections, EU elections, which have shown what's happening certainly in many parts in Europe. Does anybody want to kind of make any comment on that, on the kind of big politics impact on how we're dealing with this? I've got Days and Richard, Days and Ruth, whichever you want to go in. Richard, go first, and then Days, and then Ruth.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, what we see in the Netherlands at the moment is, of course, we should worry about it. But it's also the very populist way and thoughtless way of arguing about the whole things of climate change and that kind of things. But this goes a lot further. Also, the funding of research will be less, it's becoming less. And also, as teachers and researchers, we have to stay political neutral, and I don't know how I'm going to do that. But that are very, you know, this elaborate democracy, which is spreading around in the Netherlands now. It's not helping us. And that's an understatement, I think. But we should not be, how you say? Discouraged by it, and we should stay on. Yeah, we should really stay on.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to, because that's kind of like my scope of interest. Along with environment, I do think there's the intersection of politics. I actually ran for election before. But I think it's really interesting to have that conversation about the far right and what was that meaning to our politics. Because when we think about it, the climate crisis has given us a real opportunity to start to say, how do we decide to live differently? And how do we decide to build care into the systems that we're using? And democracy, the intention is around the care. It's about everyone having power and agency. But at the moment, a lot of people don't feel like they have power and agency within the system. So when someone like Nigel Farage comes and promises you, whether it's snake oil salesman or whatever, you're listening. And I think there's something about how do we kind of start having those conversations that are really difficult and uncomfortable with people who are thinking differently to us is a really important thing to do in this time. Because right now we're living in a time where we're post-truth. We've got misinformation going of rampant online. And this is a moment of where we can take the skills that you learn in social work, like having care for ourselves, for each other, for community, into having these hard conversations, so we can kind of see eye to eye. And I'm actually quite the big fan of deliberative democracies and citizen assemblies and finding ways to engage the electorate into politics, because that's kind of the way that we can see love in action is through our politics.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So slightly putting on my psychology hat a little bit, but I see the rise of that far-right dialogue as a coping response, as a sort of overcompensatory coping response to feelings of fear and powerlessness. And I'm really aware that we need to be careful not to be responding with a coping response to a coping response. So how do we stay in a sort of healthy adult space? How do we engage with that and understand and consider what's going on for these people? And I think it fits in a lot with, you know, how social work responds, coming back to some of the questions in the survey. I think social workers, because of that unsustainability in the actual work itself, you often feel powerless. We often feel, where have I got the time and the energy to deal with this? And that can kind of drive our coping responses. So it's kind of, how do we all look after each other so we can all stay in that healthy place and engage with it from those feelings, those values of care and skill and deliberative action.
It's getting those social work values and ways of working with others into wider change and into wider politics is thank you. I've just realised the time has flown by. I would just like, we're nearly up for coffee, but there's a question that's come online, which maybe is quite a nice one to finish on, is about should we be teaching about sustainability and all of these related issues in social work degrees and courses? Is that included in social work teaching and textbooks? Should it be? So what about, can we just maybe go around and see if there are any comments on educating for the future? Start here.
Yeah, absolutely. My students get classes in it, but because I'm there, and that's the problem. It needs to be integrated across the curriculum and across universities and across schools. And a lot of schools are doing some fantastic work on this. So if we work with the young generations, it'll bring it through into education, in higher and further education, and the professions, you know? So absolutely, but it has to be done in this integrated, holistic way. It's part of everything. Yeah. We shouldn't be siphoning off the politics from the psychology, from the, you know, it needs to be completely integrated, and that's where social workers are so brilliantly positioned, because we do see things in that holistic way. So, yeah.
Yep, Josien, yes, please.
Yeah, so true, Caroline. I recognize this in the Netherlands as well. Some universities have a special place for it, but it's not integrated. And some universities are trying to integrate it, and it's a process. I think there's a lot of work to do. And but I think that we should involve more ideas of the students themselves, because I was quite impressed by what Paddy was telling us about the bravery of young people in working on this, on having activities, etc., etc. So I think, because I am a part of the grandparents for the climate, but of course my days are counted, so we need Paddy and his folks to bring this further.
Any other comments on maybe on the education theme?
Just a small comment. Absolutely, it must be in the education, but not as something which is added to other subjects, but as an integrated part of the social work education related to inventing other values, discussing other values, etc., and other methods of working with people. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just kind of going back on what you said earlier, I think It was very interesting to hear about knowledges with an S, and using lived experience as part of the methodology to understand these sorts of things, using different understandings. Like I did a module in Indigenous ontologies, and how that allowed me to look at politics in a different way was really interesting, just by learning how Indigenous people look at their own communities. And there is something about that if we bring collaboration at the heart of this, I do actually think we've got a good chance.
Of course, knowledges is in the international definition of social work in the plural. So it is actually. So Ruth,
just very quickly, the Climate Child Protection team are linked up with educators who are looking at the issues in education and looking at it from, if you take it a safeguarding lens, children need to know about the climate crisis, but they also need to have a wider system outside of the school community that's engaged with it too, so that they're looking at, and the school community itself has got to be not just those isolated, this is how bad it is, but then this is what we do about it, this is what adults are doing about it, these are the sorts of things that you can step into. So there's a kind of broader, more social perspective on it. So there's a Ministry of Eco-Education as well, which is doing a lot of work around that.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we picked up the really important stuff you were talking about linking the climate crisis with refugees and the moving story you told about the family you knew. So I wanted to make sure you reinforce that a little bit. Sorry, I'm being bossy.
No, not at all. Yeah, I mean, I really agree with your point, Ruth. I think the best way to confront climate anxiety, to confront these feelings that we know young people feel, is to confront them head on and to take action. So yeah, education has to provide a pathway to that for young people to feel empowered somehow.
Thank you. Yeah. We had one. Have we got the mic? Where's the mic gone? Microphone? Microphone? Could you, because I did, Omar, who joined us in Rotterdam last week, I did ask if he would just make a little comment. Omar, apart from being a BASW member and very active, he also leads the new social worker group in Europe. And I did just ask if you wanted to set this up so just to give a few reflections on last week in Rotterdam, and then we will close for our coffee. So, because we're running over, I know we're running slightly over, just bear with. Omar.
Yep, so I'll just make a few comments if that's okay. And sorry to my European colleagues because I will speak fast. I wanted to make the point that, we've heard from young people today, and the next generation of social workers is something that I'm really interested in. And I always make the point that we are the next generation, we are the future, but we're also the present. We are here now. And I think this is extremely important that we engaged with students and newly qualified social workers who are going to be taking our profession forward in and this is sustainability. When we think about the workforce, and it's really important to engage with our new and young, present and future generation of social workers. So yeah.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I'm going to just go up here and say thank you to Caroline Hickman from the University of Bath, which I'm not sure I mentioned, so that to Josien from the International Federation of Social Workers and Dutch Association, Richard de Brabander from InHolland University, to Days and a climate activist, we're not sure where, but a climate activist and watch her space politically, she's going to get elected to something. Ruth Allen, who will get confused with me all day, but we're going to enjoy that. So Ruth Allen, and from Climate Child Protection and Safeguarding grouping, which is a relatively new grouping, but is doing things like this and educating us all. And Paddy, thank you so much for everything you brought to this panel, and thank you for your honesty, and we totally appreciate it bringing this all home. So thank you. Have some coffee. Find your workshops. There's lots to go to. You've now got about 20 minutes, but go upstairs to the exhibition space and have a great day, and we'll see you around.